Thanks, Hans. Good morning, my lady. My lady will be starting with Dr. Ruth Allen this morning.
If you'd like to repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Allen, good morning.
Good morning.
You are here today to give evidence as the Chief Executive of the British Association of Social Workers, or BASWA for short, a role that you have held since 2016, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you have produced a statement for the inquiry, which for those following is at INQ 30572-015. I'd like to start this morning, if I may, with a brief overview of the role that BASWA play in the adult social care sector of the UK and their membership.
Yes, so BASWA, the British Association of Social Workers, represents social work across the UK. We have a paid membership where we provide support and advice and services to, and we have a wider remit to influence the development of good social work and to also promote social work across all the nations of the UK. And that, of course, includes adult social care, but is not limited to adult social care.
And is it correct that you have about 22,000 members with approximately 40% working in adult social care and adult mental health services?
Yes, that's approximately correct, yes.
And you've told us in your statement that social workers must be qualified and registered to carry out their role, and that most social workers are employed by local authorities in England, Wales and Scotland, and health and social care trusts in Northern Ireland.
Yes, that's correct.
And despite social work being a devolved competence, and there being some variations in guidance and policy, is it right that their statutory duties are broadly the same across the UK?
Yes, they do vary. Social workers have slightly different functions, for instance, in criminal justice and probation in some parts of the UK and not in others. But there are very common themes about in relation to practice and the nature of policies, but increasing divergence because in the Four Nations it's a devolved matter predominantly.
And you've described in your statement how the adult social care sector, particularly in England, was in a markedly weakened state that impaired its ability to respond to the pandemic. And you've explained some of the vacancy rates in social work. For example, in England, it was at 8.3% in 2019. Can you perhaps explain to us why this context is so important when we're looking at the impact of the pandemic?
Yes. So the adult social care sector generally was in a weakened state, not just social work. At the start of the pandemic, the absence of the impact of austerity cuts on local authorities and other services where adult social care is delivered, the impact of a lack of the reform in policy that's needed to put adult social care on a strong footing in England, but indeed similar issues across the UK, and the lack of pandemic preparedness that we've also heard about, that we found out about really when the pandemic came. We realised how unprepared both health and social care was to respond. So all of those things have been important across adult social care. For social work itself, it's the regulated profession. It's a relatively small number in adult social care. In England, it's something like 23,000 adult social care social workers in a workforce of 1 million. But the social workers hold very particular responsibilities and accountabilities, as well as skills, expertise and practices they're absolutely essential part of the system, which I'm sure we'll come on to.
Yes, we will. Thank you. And you you refer there to it being a small workforce, and you've described in your statement that that small workforce is predominantly made up of female, older and more ethnic minorities. So how did that impact on staffing availability during the pandemic?
Yes, the social work across the UK, in fact internationally, is very largely female. It's currently about 87% women in social work in the UK. There is a preponderance for an older workforce and a more ethnically diverse workforce. How did that impact? So certainly we know that women are, particularly perhaps women at different stages of life, have different caring responsibilities to men. There's certainly evidence around that. So may have also been particularly affected by the caring for people in their families and so forth that were also affected by the pandemic. Obviously looking after children, homeschooling, a joint responsibility, but some of that will often fall on women in the family. So those were kind of some of the key issues. It's a very ethnically diverse profession. There's a higher proportion of black and minority ethnic social workers compared to the general population, so in the profession. And we know that there's a lot of evidence that black and minority ethnic people were differently affected by COVID in a variety of ways, which I won't go into, but there was a lot of evidence in relation to the physical impact of COVID on people from different ethnic communities, also people in where there was people in ethnic communities who were also perhaps within their family working in particular occupations that may have left them more exposed to the virus. So there were a whole number of interdependent issues which perhaps had an effect on the workforce.
Could I ask you to slow down if you could? I'm a fine one to talk, but if you could slow down. If you
I will. I have been told. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll descend into some of the detail, but in terms of the workforce overall, what do you identify needs to happen to ensure that we don't enter a future pandemic with social care workforce in the same or perhaps even a worse state?
So we need to learn the lessons from the pandemic for this profession and, of course, for all professions. So we really need to understand how the fact that we did have high vacancy rates. We've had more turnover in the workforce actually since the pandemic, and there was that impact of going through the pandemic that affected other professions as well, where we've seen particularly more experienced people leaving the profession. So the importance of workforce strategies at national level to train social workers for adult and children's work and for other areas to ensure that that pathway is well supported, that it is made possible for people to come into the profession. It's very expensive for many people at the moment. And so we've got that pathway in for new people, that we're supporting them properly and helping them to develop in early careers so they will stay, because we are concerned about losing experienced staff from the workforce. So a resilient workforce will have all of those stages of the workforce well supported, represented, that there's decent policy that's enabling keeping people in the profession as well as training them. All of those things are not very secure in any part of the UK for social work, as for some of the other public professions.
And perhaps now bringing it back to social work more broadly, for those listening today who may not necessarily know what role a social worker plays in adult social care, can you briefly describe some of their key responsibilities for us?
Yes. So over decades, social workers have accrued a whole range of statutory responsibilities, particularly where they're employed by or working for a statutory organisation. This includes their roles in relation to safeguarding, or adult protection as they refer to it in Scotland, in relation to mental capacity assessments and best interests, mental health Act, mental health assessments, in relation to, and then the relation to the adult social care legislation powers that exist in each of the nations. So in England, that's the Care Act. And they have specific responsibilities in practice and also in statutory guidance in England, particularly in the leadership of social care through principal social worker roles. So they are there. Much of what social work is about in statutory settings, in addition to building relationships, being able to do general assessments and support both individuals, families, carers, is to make sure that the rights of people are upheld in law according to those duties that are placed upon them. And they work in a regulated profession, so they are working to regulatory standards they also have to uphold.
And if we focus on the social care assessment, typically what will that involve and what might its purpose be?
So the social care assessments under all the legislation across the UK is quite holistic. It will take account of the health needs, the disability needs, the wishes of the person. It's very much focused on enabling people to find their own solutions and to identify what resources will help them and their families stay safe, get better, overcome their disability, whatever the issue is. So it's the role of the social worker there is to advocate for people to live the best life they can. Often they will be either the gatekeeper of resources or the advocate for gaining resources that people may be entitled to. And there's a very strong, I think in relation to this inquiry, the protective role, the protection responsibilities of social workers need to be kept to the fore. So ensuring that people are safe and are able to keep themselves safe wherever possible and can be assisted in staying safe where necessary. So there's a diversity of responsibilities. There are others, but those are some of the key ones.
Thank you. And where will those assessments usually take place?
Well, where social work happens is a very sort of important point for us in relation to the inquiry into COVID, because social workers are much more peripatetic than many health workers might be. There are other health workers who are peripatetic, but they will often be working obviously in people's homes. They will be going to people's homes. They will be going into hospitals, but in some cases working in hospitals, but often they will be going into hospitals. They may be going into prisons. They may be going into obviously care homes and working with people who are in placements of various kinds. So social workers work in very much kind of community settings. And even where they might be working in more institutional settings, a lot of their function is to be that link to community, to ordinary life, to family and so forth. So, so the assessments can be happening really in any of those contexts.
And it perhaps may seem like a question with an obvious answer, but can they be taken remotely, and are there any risks of them being taken in that way?
If the assessments are undertaken remotely. So obviously social workers, like all professions, are becoming much more skilled and in using technologies, and had to accelerate that during COVID. The importance of being able to be in the room or to be in someone's house, to be able to assess a living circumstance, to be able to be present with family, to understand the family dynamics, for instance. Those things can only be partially replicated through remote communications and through video links and so on. There was a lot of work done during COVID time to try and extend that possibility and to make the most of that. But it is essential that social workers have are properly authorised and have the facility to go and meet people when they need to, and they need to use their judgment about when that's important. That includes going into care homes where, for instance, their protective role is not just about the individuals they're going to see, but it may be about the institution. They are eyes and, very important, professional eyes and ears on how an institution is operating. So those are some of the balances and to emphasise the importance of in-person working.
I'd like to move on now then to some of the issues or experiences during the pandemic. So you have already referred to the fact that you discovered that there was a lack of preparedness, but you also refer in your statement to a lack of understanding of the social workers' role and contribution that they could make, and that BASWA made multiple requests for specific national guidance for social workers that really recognise this. What guidance were social workers being asked to follow, and what were some of the gaps that you were asking to be addressed?
Initially, I think there was virtually no specific guidance that really mentioned social workers. And what then subsequently happened when we were in communication with leaders in public health and so forth over coming months was that the general guidance for health and social care was the only thing that was available to help social workers, but didn't really take account of the specificity of what they have to do, so the context in which they have to work. So the one of the other aspects of social work is, by no means in all cases, but you're often going into a situation where your presence might not be welcomed, actually, or you're going into a situation where things are very complex. And gaining access to somebody's house because you're concerned about the welfare of an adult or a child, for instance, you need specific kinds of guidance and help in relation to that. Perhaps differently to, it will overlap with what nurses or paramedics or doctors need. Of course it overlaps, but we were clear that social workers were telling us that the tasks that they had to do, and also the guidance available to them from their employers at the earliest stage, wasn't sufficient for them to feel confident that they were undertaking things in the right way. What could they not do because of their duties? How did they judge risk in that situation? So there was, over the initial months in 2020, more guidance came out for health and social care generally, including for people working in the community. But it didn't take account, it didn't answer the questions that social workers needed answered. So we started to fill that space early on, in response, using our own understanding of what was needed, really. So it wasn't. So we were able to do that, but that isn't the same as having that statutory guidance to help people feel confident in their practice. That was also needed.
Yes. And can you provide some examples of the professional practice guidance that BASWA produced to answer those questions that social workers were asking?
Yes. So I'm just going to quickly grab a document if I can find it. Yes, that's our summary. We did a lot of different kinds of guidance. Practice guidance in relation to home visiting, for instance, ethical guidance because people were struggling with the ethics of how do I think through what I do and don't do, or the ethics of doing things differently if I can't see a child or an adult. How do I raise an issue? How do I understand the extent to which I am or am not fulfilling my duties? That kind of thing. We did guidance on working with digital tools, and we did guidance in relation to the role of approved mental health professionals and mental health officers, capacity assessments. We provided a range of things. Yeah.
And given the expertise that that BASWA was able to bring to that guidance, in your view, was it in the best position to be able to produce that guidance, and would you do so in future, or is your view that that should be national guidance in future?
So I think, having reviewed a lot of this for this hearing, I think we produced some really useful guidance that was well received, that aligned with what the government was saying. It wasn't contradictory, but it really augmented and, where necessary, went in slightly different directions that weren't being covered. So I think we were well placed to do that, and we had a lot of feed-in because we had a running open communication which ended up with about 2,000 submissions from social workers. So we were able to draw on that and use our own knowledge. I think for the future, for pandemic preparedness, we would expect to see social work on the same footing as any other profession, being recognised for its role in emergencies and disasters, for which there's quite an extensive and growing kind of body of work, contemporary work around that. And then to, for instance, use some of our guidance and to work together with government and others to have things in place. A type of pandemic or emergency, each would be different. So it wouldn't be exactly the same, but there are some principles I think we could draw on about what social workers need to know to discharge their duties that are overlap but are different to some of the other duties of other public professionals.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm not quite following. How are you saying we should prepare for it differently? In other words, it sounds to me as if you were very much the experts in the field, and therefore your guidance was particularly helpful to social workers. But what are you suggesting should happen in the future? Are you suggesting there should be more government involvement or government principles? I'm just not quite following what specifically you're suggesting.
So social work is represented within the governments. There are social work leaders in governments, chief social work officers with slightly different titles. So there is a context in which social work can be represented in, for instance, highest level pandemic planning, highest level disaster or emergency planning. What's the role of the social worker? So I'm saying that wasn't there. I don't think that had been thought about previously in pandemic planning, and that could now be considered. And an organisation like BASWA, just like the BMA or the RCN or the colleges, the Royal Colleges, we've got lots of detailed knowledge and experience and expertise to share, and could inform that. So there should be a partnership really between government recognising the role of social workers and the experts who are in different organisations can add to that.
That I follow, but Ms. Hans was asking you about guidance. So you've moved on to the broader topic, which I totally and utterly follow. But I think it started off with questions about the guidance and whether there should be a different system.
Okay. Well, I think it's a bit difficult to answer that because we were responding to the guidance that was needed in this pandemic at that point in time, and it would be different in the future. I think that in such a situation, we were well placed to provide guidance. It would have been better if we had been able to do that in real time, in more cooperation with leading officials as well, so that we could further promote the guidance that we were putting out. Does that?
I'm still not quite following specifically. If I were persuaded that it would be right to make a recommendation, I have to be quite specific.
Oh, I see. Yes. Okay.
Because otherwise it can't be implemented.
No. So I think the profession, BASWA as a professional body, should be called upon to provide guidance in a situation like this, and to do that in conjunction with social work leaders within government and in other related parts of government in a situation of emergency or disaster, but in other circumstances as well. But that's the circumstance. Does that? I think
it's basically it's greater collaboration between those who have the expertise, like your organisation.
Yes.
Thank you, my lady.
Yes.
You have provided in your statement quite a few examples of the changes to social work that were seen during the pandemic. I'd like to ask you about just a couple of them. One of those is around the exceptional powers and arrangements in relation to some social work which were brought in with the Coronavirus Act that gave local authorities discretion to disapply parts of the Care Act and the equivalents in Wales in relation to assessment and care planning in defined circumstances. And you've said that if there had been better preparation, that it would have helped the implementation process. But you've also said that parts of that framework were unclear. Can I ask you what parts specifically your members found were unclear?
Yes, I think one of the key areas which came with the for instance, the easements legislation that was brought in England, and I just want to make a slight correction on paragraph 38, where just in relation to that, where it says in the end formal easements were not introduced. That's misstated there because we're aware that they were enacted, but they were hardly used. And I think the fact they were hardly used in a way is testimony to the fact that it was unclear how to use them actually in practice for local authorities. But sorry, your question was about in what ways were these pieces, the Coronavirus Act and the easements, unclear?
Yes, I think you've said parts of the framework were unclear, and I was just asking you what parts specifically or concerns you had.
Yeah, there was one specific area which, in relation to the Coronavirus Act and the easements actually, which was related to the point at which how an assessment would be made that the provisions under the European Convention on Human Rights and or under our Human Rights Act, that human rights were being breached. It was unclear how you would operationalise that assessment, because it's not an assessment that social care workers generally will be making. Local authorities certainly do have to consider whether their work is compliant with the Human Rights Act, but it wasn't clear how operationally in day-to-day practices, people making decisions on the ground in real time would understand how that might be the case. So that was one of the issues.
Were BASRA consulted during the process of drafting of this legislation?
Not the Coronavirus Act, but the easements in England. Yes, we were. And there was good collaboration with the interim chief social workers who led on an ethical framework related to the easements. So we were to be fair, we were consulted in relation to the ethical framework that the interim joint chief social workers worked on. So we were very involved in that. So that was where we were able to bring our expertise on ethics and interpretation of law and its implications for practice.
And was that was that incorporated into the framework?
It was incorporated into the ethics framework, yes. We could see our work incorporated into the ethics framework.
And moving on to the topic of discharging of patients from hospital during the pandemic. You have said in your statement that the vast majority of discharges will take place without the involvement of a social worker. But there are no national protocols in place for when a social worker might be called in or when additional support might be required at the point of discharge. Did that lack of a national protocol have any impact on discharge decisions during the pandemic, in your experience?
Yes, I think the issues around discharge became obviously quite complicated by the concerns around discharge without testing and rapidity of discharge, which meant that perhaps even more than prior, social workers weren't necessarily involved or brought in to support that discharge. And it's a really crucial area for. I know that discharge planning is a huge ongoing issue about ensuring flow through hospitals, and freeing up hospital beds is a massive issue for the NHS and for social care. But ensuring that there is a good practice would say that you would be planning for discharge from the point that somebody arrives in hospital, not just in a coronavirus situation, but that would generally happen. And there would be a social work resource that would be able to use the powers of the Care Act or the legislation in Wales, Northern Ireland or Scotland to ensure that there's a proportionate and holistic consideration of what safe discharge would look like. So having clarity about the role of the social workers there would really help protect people's rights.
And you've described in your statement how many social work teams were moved out of hospitals. So did that lack of access have any impact on whether a person underwent an assessment prior to discharge? And were there any changes in rates of referrals, for example, that you were able to observe?
I'm not sure about the rates of referrals, but I couldn't answer that specifically. But I think the process of speeding up discharge, which was already something that was being worked on prior to the pandemic really hitting, there was work going on in relation to that. But then implementing discharge to assess and implementing rapid discharge without assessment by a social worker, or perhaps even an overview from a social worker, was problematic. It added to the risks that were subsequently evident from that rapid discharge without testing that flowed through the system and the spread of infections into care homes.
And were you aware of any safeguards that were in place to ensure patients who were discharged during the pandemic prior to that assessment taking place in that procedure, whether they received a full assessment of their support needs once they'd been discharged?
Well, there was certainly in the earlier stages of the pandemic, there was the problem that social workers could not access care homes. They were not recognised as essential visitors into care homes. And this is the point I was making about how social workers are often ones going into institutions. The institutions were locked down, and we ultimately had a fairly successful campaign, Test Access Rights, which was to ensure that social workers could be recognised for in safe visiting into care homes to protect people's rights, because to ensure that people's capacity to consent to that placement had been taken into and best interests considerations, to ensure obviously that people were being protected from a health point of view, and to also to consider the impact of people not being able to see their families on somebody's health. All of those things needed to, and others, needed to be taken into consideration for those people who'd been moved perhaps into a care home some people may have been going back to a care home, but maybe into a care home for the first time out of hospital, and possibly rapidly. So for us, one of the key issues was whether or not social workers could access people to make those assessments.
And it's right that campaign was launched in November 2020, isn't
yes,
it?
Yes.
And how quickly did you start to see the results or an improvement in the situation after that campaign was launched?
And of course, there were many others who were very concerned about this as well, who were also working with other organisations and family members and so forth as well. We had a quicker response in Wales than we did in England, as I recall, I think Welsh Government acted more receptively, and we worked with the Minister there to ensure that this was recognised. It had gone on for a long time by then, and we had raised the issue in a whole number of ways. And then eventually it was opened up in England, and similar processes were happening in the rest of the UK. I can't recall all the detail. But yes, so it was very necessary, but it was a long time coming, actually, because social workers were kind of locked out of being able to fulfil that role.
I think you've said in your statement that the access to tests in England certainly remained variable in March 2021. So were there still issues with the implementation at that point?
I would have to double check on exactly when it came through, but it was, I think there were several months. I think the Welsh Government response was very quick after we launched that campaign and collaborated with others. And I think it was several months later that we, but you'd have to check on the exact time point when it changed in England. I would check that.
Just finishing the topic of the discharge to assess and hospital discharge, to your knowledge, was there any auditing of the discharge to assess cases either during or after the pandemic to ensure that those that had been discharged through that process were then assessed?
I've not seen any evidence of that being collated. I don't know if that exists. I've not seen any. I've not seen any strong data on that.
And has BASWA observed any long-term impact of that?
The long-term impact obviously included the fact that that many people died in care homes, and some 46,000, and there is a strong case to be made that was obviously there were many reasons for that, but that rapid discharge without testing, and also, especially in the early part, of course, a lack of access to testing and regular testing regimes in care homes and amongst care workers, all of those things contributed. In terms of the discharge to assess is still a key kind of policy area and has been funded sort of nationally and locally since the pandemic. So that work on, and there is a case for discharge to assess as a general model. There is a case for it. The key thing is the point of discharge has to be strongly assessed enough to make sure that initial move is good enough, or is good for that person, and then there needs to be very clear access to a social worker and others who can make the longer term arrangements within a prompt way. So it's getting the whole pathway right remains an issue, I think.
A review carried out by the Department of Health and Social Care into the discharge to assess model used during the pandemic recommended that in future there should be the need for flexibility and local variation in implementation, but also emphasised that need for the holistic evaluation, which you started with at the beginning of your evidence today. Do you agree with those suggestions for improving the policy in future, and do you think they can still be upheld during a future pandemic?
Can you just go back to the first part of your point there, just the first bits of it?
Yes, was it about the need for flexibility and local variation in implementing the policy?
In implementing discharge to assess?
Exactly.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think social care is very... social care processes obviously are managed through 151 local authorities in England and many local authorities elsewhere. So there's a lot of... it's very different from the NHS as we know in that regard. It's very much locally managed and locally accountable. I think the importance of learning from what works in particular communities, what might work for one community might not work for another community to some extent. But in terms of other kinds of flexibilities, I think we just need to know what the evidence is for the value of discharge to assess. We need to see solid evidence of that, and then see what flexibilities around that evidence work for different communities. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if it does.
I guess the second part of it was around whether you think that those principles can still be in place during a pandemic. So if there's advanced planning that involves the discharge to assess model, perhaps some of the research that you've just suggested, do you think that those principles can still be upheld during a future pandemic with the preparedness in place?
So the reason, I think this depends on the particular circumstance. We had so pandemic planning would need to take account of the suitability, of the sufficiency of beds, because that was one of the key issues we had far fewer suitable types of bed than many similar countries, which meant that our bed pressures were particularly high, as well as a very large number of people falling ill. So for pandemic preparedness, we would need to be, I guess, modelling different flows of people coming through hospitals at different levels of hospital resourcing, and then looking at the extent to which we need the rapid discharge, because perception was we needed rapid discharge to bring people through. That would almost certainly be needed again if we had something similar. So we just really need to have the protocols of safety protocols around testing for if it's a pandemic, whatever the illness is, the protocols around how you assure people's needs are properly and holistically assessed within a timely way. If it's not in hospital, it has to be quickly afterwards, and to ensure that the principles that underpin the relevant legislation across the UK of holistic, needs-led, but also strengths-based, and people's wishes being taken into that can't be ridden over. It has to be upheld through that process, even if you're having to move people through the system quicker.
And one of the issues that you have raised in your statement that you heard from your members was around that lack of access, preventing them from being able to build relationships, trust and rapport with some of the people that they were working with, and the impact that might have on the safety of their decisions. And I think BASWA produced professional practice guidance on safeguarding for adults to try and support its members with those decisions. So what measures were put in place, if any, to mitigate the risks faced by people that were needing care that perhaps couldn't have that face-to-face assessment?
It was genuinely very difficult, and a lot of things just didn't happen, particularly in the early months. Social workers were still out working in communities, trying to gain access or to making home visits, creating their own PPE if they couldn't get hold of any. They were visiting people at home and trying to maintain relationships, sort of doorstep conversations rather than visiting in people's homes. And then we provided some guidance to help people think through all of their options for sustaining relationships. So, for instance, we were, one of the things with younger people particularly, but others as well, was that some local authorities were very restrictive on social workers being able to use things like apps to communicate, social media, but that can actually work. That can work very well, but there were lots of safety concerns. Local authorities weren't as well versed as they are now in technologies. So we were encouraging people to use technologies to work with their managers and so forth to try and do that. So to use whatever we had, what was available, and think more creatively.
And did that raise any issues with digital exclusion or issues with communication that people might have had?
Absolutely. The need to move to digital was evident, and we were clear we needed to help social workers do that safely and and optimise that wherever they could. So we tried to help with that. But it's just not suitable for some people who are very perhaps cognitively impaired. People may find that difficult. People who've never used computers, people who don't have access to it, they don't have the devices, they don't have data. All of the usual digital exclusion issues would arise with that, and it's not it can't stand in place of human contact in all cases. It just can't, because you can't assess properly.
Yeah. Thank you. If I could perhaps ask you to just keep your answers just
Sure.
ever so slightly shorter so that we can make sure we cover all of the key issues you'd like to today. So moving on to another issue, and that's end-of-life care and DNA CPR notices. The inquiry's heard a lot of evidence on this topic, but you've explained how BASWA produced professional practice guidance on end-of-life care in April 2020 in response to concerns about the reported blanket use of DNA CPR notices. So my question is this, did BASWA receive any reports of blanket use of DNA CPR notices from its members that prompted it to produce that guidance when other guidance was already available?
Yes, we did. Mainly sort of personal individuals contacting us to say that they were seeing this, they were experiencing it. But it wasn't we didn't do any studies to identify that systematically. But it was also coming up in feed-in from others as well. I mean, some doctors were raising issues, other professions were raising concerns about the use of that. So yes, so it came through in a number of different ways.
And to your knowledge, did those concerns continue to arise after the professional guidance that you issued, but also the national statements and guidance that were issued in April 2020?
Yeah, I think that was I remember that specifically. It was a very important statement, and I think we were then just keen to make sure that our members knew what they could do to challenge if they saw that happening, and that we would support them and guide them if they needed to raise the inappropriate use of DNR statements.
Moving on to a different topic, and this time around PPE and IPC. Another issue which you say was a significant theme in BASWA's activities, particularly at the start of the pandemic, which culminated in a letter to the UK Prime Minister from BASWA on the 1st of April 2020. So starting with access to PPE, how widespread were those concerns amongst the social worker workforce at the start?
At the start, it was probably the primary concern. Social workers were still working in the communities. They'd all were working from home, not in offices mostly, but they were then still largely going out working in communities. They were concerned for their own welfare, and they were very much concerned for the welfare of people they were trying to reach, and they didn't have access to PPE, or they had inconsistent access.
Would social workers wear or use PPE in non-pandemic times?
Only if they were probably in quite a specialist setting. So if they were working in a hospital and that was needed, and others were using that same sort of equipment. Yeah.
And did access to PPE improve in your experience?
Yes, it did. It improved quicker for social workers who were in hospital contexts than it did in local authorities and other social care contexts. It was later and more protracted and more unreliable in wider social care contexts. But yes, in our survey that we did at the end of 2020, there's some evidence there that people were reporting that the access to PPE had by then improved. But it was a long period. It was many months of, and it was a primary concern for many. Yeah.
And touching on the topic of guidance in the context of IPC and PPE, it's right, isn't it, that BASWA produced its own professional practice guidance in April 2020, which linked to different pieces of public health guidance. So you've already mentioned the fact that social workers weren't necessarily recognised and their role that they played in guidance generally. Did this also apply to IPC and PPE?
Yes, so we provided guidance on the use of PPE, actually, and how to adapt practice to the use of, if you're using masks and gloves, it's very practical. How do you continue to communicate well if you're using that kind of PPE? So we provided that and other kinds of guidance, yes.
And did the national guidance take into account the fact that social workers would be moving from setting to setting or house to house, for example?
Well, we only had from the governmental advice was blanket advice for if you're effectively if you're an institutional or parapathetic health or care worker, you can these are the ways in which you should use PPE. The difficulty for using PPE for social workers in particular contexts wasn't particularly explored, so we filled some of that gap. For instance, people undertaking mental health act assessments. How do you deal with wearing masks when you're working with somebody who's very, very distressed? And those sorts of things were key issues.
And were your members able to access alternatives to PPE? So, for example, the transparent masks or visors? And did they help with those communication difficulties?
Yes, I think using, I mean, where they were available, I think everybody knows that it was difficult to get the right kinds of PPE in certain contexts. But yes, I mean, they would use what was available. It was very variable in the first 6 months about what would be available and when it would be available. The social care sector generally, even in care homes, they had we were being told about very unreliable supply lines in the early days, and that within adult social care.
Were you aware of your members having experiences where they were unable to carry out a visit or an assessment in person due to a lack of access to suitable PPE?
Yes, that is exactly the sort of thing that our members were telling us in the early days, yes.
You have explained in your statement that social workers in future should receive training on IPC and PPE in advance of any future pandemic. So was there enough training in advance of the coronavirus pandemic for social workers in the use of IPC and PPE to start with?
It was completely there was no training. If you worked in a hospital, you would probably have had some training because you may need to use it on occasions. But if you weren't working in a health or integrated setting like that, it was very alien to people, I would say.
And what impact did that have on your members?
It prevented them from undertaking key tasks that they really wanted to do. They were looking for ways around that. So how could they visit people safely at home, etc. And I think it undermined their confidence. And it also, I think, particularly left social workers feeling like their professional needs weren't being acknowledged or recognised or met in the rollout of this key provision.
And was there appropriate training provided during the pandemic, to your knowledge?
So within employers, I think that training in PPE and other aspects of changed practice started to happen as organisations became more knowledgeable about what to do. So, again, in our survey, we found that from the start of the pandemic through to the end of that year, there was some acknowledgement that managers and organisations had started to really improved their support and training for social workers.
So around the end of 2020 was when
Yeah,
you
there
really
was-
saw an improvement.
Yes, I mean, it was still very difficult, but things had improved, I think, by then.
I'd like to take you to some of the results of the BASWA survey that you've been referring to. So if we can please have on screen INQ 30509 534 0003. Thank you. I'd like to just pull out some of the key findings from that survey to ask you about. So the first one is number 9. Thank you. So 30.7% of respondents felt pressured to work when unwell. In your experience, what was leading to that level of pressure?
I think that there was a few things. There were a lot of issues around availability of staff because quite a lot of people were off sick with coronavirus, or they were isolating because they were at risk. So there was pressure on remaining staff, I think, to continue going in. There's a general trend in social work that we find from other surveys around presenteeism and people coming into work even when they're not quite well. So there's an underlying overwork ethic to some degree. And there was such a sense of urgent, I wouldn't call it panic, but there was such a sense of urgency and general concern, and having to work in different ways and support each other. Peer support was very important. So I think people did feel a strong sense of peer responsibility to their colleagues as well to make sure they were continuing to work. So I think there's some underlying factors there about people feeling very motivated and just keeping on working anyway. There were, a number of factors.
And the next finding was that 71.5% agreed or strongly agreed that the coronavirus crisis had adversely impacted workplace morale in their place of employment.
Yeah.
In BASWA's experience, what factor had the biggest impact on morale?
This would be somewhat subjective, but based on all of the feedback that we had and the surveys that we did, in the initial stages, there was a lot of confusion about how do we keep doing our work in this context. And of course, there was people were asked to work from home, and so they were isolated from their colleagues. I think that had an impact. Everybody was affected by the coronavirus like everybody else was. So people had family and friends ill, or they had lost loved ones. I think that one of the key issues, though, that came through in a number of ways was that people not being able to do what they knew was the right thing to do because they couldn't always carry out their duties.
And then finally, at number 12, 58.8% agreed or strongly agreed that their working during the crisis had negatively impacted upon their own mental health. Now, you've told us in your statement that BASWA produced a staff risk assessment flowchart to help employers to carry out risk assessments and also to support their employees. So was there adequate mental health support available for the social worker workforce?
I think this was one area where employers realised they needed to do more over the time of the pandemic. And some employers certainly started to innovate in this area to be much more open about the need to understand the mental health needs of their workforce and put in more support. But yes, certainly similar features to the impact on morale would have played a part in that. I would just add in for both of those, actually, I would want to mention lack of recognition of the work that social workers were doing in comparison to the recognition that some other parts of the health and the care sector were getting. But I think that lack of appreciation of the work that was also a factor for morale. I don't know if it was a factor for mental health. But it was people would just talk about how it's extremely stressful.
And finally, Dr. Allen, you've set out a number of recommendations in your statement, and we've discussed a number of recommendations today. Are there any other recommendations for a future pandemic that you may wish to draw the Chair's attention to this morning?
Yes, I think the overarching issue is to understand that social workers have key and distinctive statutory responsibilities that are placed on them by governments and by society, and they also have particular practices they need to fulfil, and they couldn't fulfil them without better guidance, and they can't fulfil those without the right context and conditions being supported in that, whether that's by resources or guidance or recognition, but also a recognition, particularly in adult social care, of their leadership, coordination and risk management role and protection role. And I think that was sidelined in the coronavirus period, and that left individuals vulnerable, and it left families unsupported. And I think the particular importance that we've already touched on around social workers being seen as key in emergencies and disaster situations, and that the role of social workers being represented in the most senior governmental and regional level planning, as well as in the provision of guidance, which of course, as we've talked about, can be a collaboration between governments and professional bodies. And really that social work should be seen as an equivalent to health colleagues, and social care to be seen as equivalent to healthcare in the importance in protecting and supporting individuals and families.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. I'm very grateful. Lady, those were all my questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hans. Mr. Wilcock, I think it's you.
Good morning, Ms. Allen. Thank you very much for coming to ask questions. I've been given permission to ask you on 4 topics, but in fact you've already been taken through 2 of them in some detail, so we're reduced to 2. The first topic actually follows on from what you've just said. You've talked a lot in your evidence, particularly at the beginning, about the relationship between government and social workers in adult social care, and you just ended by talking about the lack of recognition that social workers had. I just wondered, would it have helped, in theory, at least, having a minister with direct responsibility for adult social care in terms of building that relationship?
So there are ministerial roles across the UK with responsibility for adult social care. I think for instance, we worked quite a lot with Helen Whately in England, and colleagues around the UK worked with equivalents. But social work is a small part of social care, and it's complex, and it has it's a very large workforce. That all of those matters tend to overwhelm the priorities. And social work, as the regulated, and indeed the other regulated professions in social care, like occupational therapy and nursing, don't really get as much attention. And yet it's the regulated professions that are carrying a lot of the risk and the coordination responsibilities and the kind of practice leadership responsibilities.
So I should have made clear, obviously I'm representing families from Northern Ireland, and they have an integrated system.
Yes.
Is there a similar Northern Ireland minister for adult social care?
There is, yes, there is. There is a social care minister, and there was a social care minister at the time, but the extent to which they were aware of, knowledgeable about, supportive of social work, I don't know. That role, the role of supporting social work, was with the chief social worker, who's obviously not a ministerial appointment and who is also a deputy director general, if I've got that right as well at the time, in Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much. Second topic, discharge from hospital. You told us, and you describe in your statement, how social workers often play a key role in the discharge from hospital of the most vulnerable and isolated in society. And you go on to explain how during the pandemic, the requirement to undertake continuous healthcare assessments of patients was reduced in order to reduce pressures on the health service. Now, I assume that statement was actually drafted with reference to England and Wales
Yes,
in particular.
yes.
Was there an equivalent in Northern Ireland?
I don't know, actually. I don't know what, how I don't know how the legal provisions were
that's
changed.
fine.
I'm sorry. No.
So now that we know we're dealing with England and Wales,
Yeah.
can I just ask you, would you have expected the chief social worker to have been consulted in relation to that policy, and were they?
Absolutely, would have expected that. It was a very clear and very senior role that was of chief social worker at that time. I would have expected them to be thoroughly involved in all decisions that would have an impact, for instance, in this case, on something like discharge, where social work assessment was so crucial.
Was BASWA consulted?
There was no. BASWA was not consulted on the changes to discharge processes. We would have been aware, but we weren't consulted. We were then responding to the change that happened and that as it played out through the coronavirus period.
If you had been consulted, what would you have said?
I know that members who work on this, our members who work particularly on this area, have raised a whole number of issues about discharge to assess, which I've kind of broadly covered, that to ensure that people's rights are protected and their wishes fulfilled, there has to be enough assessment at the point of discharge, and then it has to be really followed up, and that was overlaid with the clinical risk that was there
Which you
during
explained to us
coronavirus.
earlier. Yeah. Thank you very much. Much as I'd love to, I've got no further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilcott. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton's right over there.
Thank you, my lady. Good morning, Dr. Allen.
Good morning.
I ask questions on behalf of the COVID-19 bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. I have a question for you in relation to the availability of testing in Wales, which you've already just touched upon in your evidence. And if there's time, one in relation to inspections in Wales. First question concerns the content of your statement at paragraph 73 and 74, and as you have just explained earlier, about your concerns for the need for access of social care workers to care settings, including care homes, to ensure the rights of residents are upheld. And you refer to particular concerns around mental capacity and some reports from your members that residents who had requested to go home were being refused on grounds of lack of mental capacity. And you told the inquiry that you campaigned for testing to enable social care worker access.
Yes.
And in Wales, that testing was announced to commence from the 14th of December, twice weekly. The question I have for you relates to when in practice that testing was actually made available to your members. I think Counsel to the Inquiry asked you a similar question in relation to England. I wonder whether you can recall any specific details about the situation in Wales.
So certainly the response of Welsh Government was quicker in Wales than it was in England to see the importance of this change. And so that happened, and I do recall that was recognised by our members as as an improvement, and it started to happen. How quickly and how widely that was available in practice, I couldn't answer. But the policy change happened, and then as a consequence of that, implementation started to happen.
Thank you. I think then I have time to ask you about inspections, please. At paragraphs 91 to 95, you indicate your concerns about the lack of scrutiny and oversight of care homes during the pandemic, including the suspension of inspections.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, do you think enough was done in Wales over this period to monitor and support care homes during the pandemic?
My understanding is that monitoring of what was happening in care homes throughout this whole period in all the countries of the UK was inadequate. At CQC in England suspended all of their inspections. My understanding is that there were similar suspensions across the UK, and I remember clearly at the time thinking how just the suspension and no adjustment seemed inappropriate, given that these care homes were going to be at very significant risk. People were going to be at significant risk inevitably by what was happening with the pandemic.
Dr. Allen, were you aware that inspections of care homes in Wales in 2020 had reduced to just 20% of the level in the previous year?
I wasn't aware of that figure, but given what I understood was happening across all of the nations, it doesn't surprise me. I think the issue was the fact that there were the consequences of inspections not happening, but I don't think I ever fully understood the rationale for that, other than to say, well, you can't go into care homes because of infection risk, but care workers were having to go in every day. So how could you... The need for monitoring and inspection was heightened rather than reduced. It was a question of trying to work out how possibly to do that. I didn't hear any strong rationale for why it had been suspended completely.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Ms. Fubiser.
Thank you, my lady. Dr. Allen, good morning. I represent John's campaign, the Patients Association and Care Rights UK. You've given evidence this morning about problems with the exclusion of social work teams from hospital discharges. And at paragraph 40 of your witness statement, you specifically raised concerns about the requirement to undertake continuing healthcare assessments being revoked for patients being sent home upon discharge in order to reduce pressure on the health service. What was the impact of this on people needing care and the quality and suitability of care and support that they received post-discharge?
Well, I think we've covered some of this already in the sense that clearly rapid discharge without full assessment into care settings that were under tremendous pressure was inevitably going to lead to people being in, at least some people being in unsuitable settings, but also being at risk in those settings. So I think I would answer it in that way. I think the not any delay in the fact that social workers couldn't access care home residents who had been rapidly discharged in order to make holistic assessments meant that those individuals were not receiving a good service and were potentially put at risk.
And what was the impact of the revocation of those assessments on the loved ones, familiar carers, or those providing care?
Yes, I haven't said very much about families, and that's not at all intentional, because I'm very, very exercised by the impact on families of everything that's happened. And we did quite a lot of work with families during this time, or with carers, organisations and carers. So a huge impact of lack of access and fears for loved ones, and not understanding the consequences perhaps of some of the rapidity of moving people out of hospitals may have been in people's best interests, but I'm sure for many families there was a sense that holistic and comprehensive assessments just weren't happening. That would be my understanding.
Thank you, Dr. Allen.
Thank you very much, Ms. Webster. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Allen. That completes the questions we have. We are very grateful for the help you've given to the inquiry.
Thank you.
And I've certainly got the message about recognition of the role of social workers.
Thank
you. In a pandemic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We shall break now and I shall return to 11:30. Ms. John.
My lady, the next witness is Professor Vic Rayner.
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please sit down, please.
Swapping roles now.
Professor Rayner, your full name, please.
Victoria Rayner.
Thank you. And you are the Chief Executive Officer of the National Care Forum.
Yep,
You've been in that role since 2016.
I have, yeah.
And is it correct that the National Care Forum is a representative body for not-for-profit care and support organisations?
Yes.
Primarily operating in England, although some of them also do operate in the devolved nations.
Yes.
And is it right that therefore your focus is primarily in England and that's what your statement and your evidence today will cover?
Yes.
Does the National Care Forum currently represent 176 provider organisations?
Yes.
And they collectively provide care and support to over 260,000 adults.
Yes.
They operate over 8,000 services,
Yep.
provide more than 56,000 care home places, and employ over 145,000 staff.
Yes.
During the pandemic, as at July 2020, is it right that your membership totalled 120 members?
Yes.
So there's been an increase of almost 50% since the pandemic. To what extent, if at all, do you think that that's attributable to the raised profile and visibility of the National Care Forum during the pandemic?
Possibly, yes. I mean, we spent a lot of time in the pandemic supporting organisations, and we were very clear that we wanted to extend that to the broadest possible scope of organisations. So many more people would have got our resources and support and got engaged with the work we did during the pandemic, yes.
Thank you. And so currently, what proportion of the not-for-profit sector do you represent?
I think there's about 20% of the overall care sector is not-for-profit, and in the context of something like care home places, the National Care Forum has about 15% of the overall places. So, I mean, it will vary on a service-by-service basis, but a significant number of those not-for-profit provisions will be within our membership.
Could I ask you just to slow down a little bit,
Yes, of
please?
course.
Thank you. Is it right that in terms of the types of adult social care services that are operated by your members, the majority of them operate nursing homes and or residential care homes?
I think our membership is very diverse, so lots of members. Interestingly, in the not-for-profit sector, lots of organisations will operate multiple types of services. So that's different often to the for-profit sector, where they might just operate care homes or home care. So in the not-for-profit sector, because they have been part of communities often for centuries, if they're charitable organisations, they might do nursing homes, care homes, day services, community services, extra care housing. They might offer all those different types of services within one organisation.
I see, thank you. And I think you have there just covered the range of services that your members provide. In terms of the categories of people that are supported, does that cover older people, people with learning disabilities, physical disabilities, mental health needs, those with dementia and other needs,
Yes,
such as
all
addiction?
all adult services.
Thank you.
And some members will provide transition services between children's and adult services as well.
Thank you. Can you just give us an overview of the types of not-for-profit organisations in your membership, please?
Yes, so we'll have charities. We'll have what are called LATCOs, which is local authority trading companies, housing associations, non-shareholding community interest companies, anything. And we have now within our membership some local authority direct provision as well.
When did that come in?
Just very recently.
So before that didn't exist during the pandemic?
No.
And can you just tell us a bit more, please, about the funding and commissioning structures
Of the not-for-profit
of the not-for-profit organisations that are in your membership?
They operate within the wider care sector, so the commissioning arrangements will be as they are for other care providers. So they'll be commissioned directly by local authorities, or people will pay for their own care if they're self-funders, or they are commissioned by health organisations if they're providing perhaps mental health services, drug and alcohol support services, those types of things. So they have a variety of different funders and commissioners.
Are you able to help us as to what percentage of your members are publicly funded as opposed to?
Probably, so if it's working age adults, almost all working age adult services are publicly funded. If it's older people's services, then there will be a mix of provision. So because of the way social care is means tested, if people are providing residential care, for example, they will generally have a mix of people within a home, some whom are directly funded by the state and some who are funded for self-funded. It would vary from a home-by-home basis.
Thank you. And could I just ask you once more to slow down a little bit?
Apologies.
Because everything you say is being recorded, and it's important that it's recorded accurately. Thank you. Can you help us as to whether there are any structural or operational differences between not-for-profit and for-profit providers that were particularly significant in the context of pandemic response, for example, in relation to resources or relationships with commissioners?
So from the main structural difference is not-for-profit organisations will reinvest any surplus back into the organisations that they're running. So that will go back in either to invest in the care that they're delivering, the building perhaps, or the types of services they're able to offer, or in the staff and the payments to staff. So there's any surplus funding is redirected into the organisation.
And sorry to interrupt, how would that have impacted on pandemic response?
So there have been a number of independent studies that have looked at what the model of how the model of delivery might impact. So I think the inquiry's heard about the Vivaldi study, and that highlighted some better outcomes in not-for-profit provision services. And there was a study called the Fitch study, which looked at the financial impact of COVID in care homes, which reported on better return, better staff experiences during the pandemic in not-for-profit provision in terms of staff satisfaction and well-being.
And just briefly, why do you think that structure led to better outcomes?
I think there are a number of things that are also different in a not-for-profit organisation. One of those is the governance. Often they are governed by local. If they're a local organisation, they will be governed by a board who's made up of local representatives who will be invested in the long-term, ongoing provision of that service to serve that community. And I think they also often come from a perspective of charitable purpose, and their aims and objectives will make it absolutely clear their need to serve their community and ensure ongoing delivery.
Thank you. And as far as the workforce is concerned, are there any distinguishing features that we should be aware of? Again, that would have impacted on the pandemic?
Yes, I mean, we've carried out long-term surveys on pay terms and conditions across the workforce with our members, and generally, when we've compared those against statistics from organisations like Skills for Care, there have been better terms and conditions in some of the services. It's very difficult to say that universally, but that's one of the things that came out through some of those surveys in the past. Some of that was pre-pandemic. Obviously, we weren't in a position to look at the detail during the pandemic, but we continue to look at those operating environments, and we continue to offer extensive support to our members to encourage them to look at things like the sort of funding conditions that were available during the pandemic and encourage them to utilise those for staff in that way.
And to what extent does your workforce include, for example, people who are on 0-hour contracts?
Some of the when we've looked at that pre-pandemic, certainly it wasn't a huge part of the workforce. It's less common generally across the sector in residential than home care, and within our membership there's not huge numbers of home care deliveries. But it's one of the areas that's driven often by commissioning behaviour as well. It's not necessarily a decision made by an employer based on a particular type of employment. It may be driven by the need to commission in that, to employ in that way because of the way they're commissioned to deliver services.
And can you help us as to what percentage or proportion of your members do deliver home care?
I haven't.
It doesn't have to be exact, just to give us an indication.
They'll deliver it as part of their services. So I don't think there's any of our members who are home care only, so they'll be delivering it alongside other services. If I look at, So 30% of our members have some home care.
Thank you. And I'll be moving on later to your role during the pandemic, but one of those was advocating on behalf of the sector.
Yes.
And so when you did that, was it on behalf of both the home care and the care home sector, which are the main areas we're focusing on in this module, or were you focused primarily on care and on residential and nursing homes?
So our advocacy was generally across all of members' services, but we worked very closely with colleagues like the Home Care Association, who had a very specific and unique focus on home care. So where we could add value to that, we did. Where they could benefit from the things we were working on, we did that too. We worked very collaboratively.
Thank you. And we'll be hearing from home care later on in this module. Thank you. Can I ask you briefly about pre-pandemic structure and capacity? The inquiries heard quite a bit about this, but just help us as to whether there were any pre-existing issues which were especially pronounced for not-for-profit providers, and in what ways the pre-existing weaknesses affected the ability of those providers to respond to the pandemic on the ground, please.
I think there were many pre-existing pressures that have been highlighted by multiple green papers and white papers and a whole variety of commissions, and they've looked at a number of core areas. One is about the lack of funding and investment in the sector. The other is about the lack of focus on the workforce and the lack of workforce strategy and plan. And the other is about the lack of recognition and partnership. These were things that were evident for the not-for-profit sector as well as the wider social care sector. I think in the context of not-for-profit organisations specifically, they were trying very hard often to operate a wide variety of services, as I've talked about. What that means is that they create an organisation model that requires some sort of central contribution from each element of services. And what was happening pre-pandemic was significant constriction in commissioning arrangements. So, for example, many of them would have offered what were described as preventative services, so non-regulated care services, alongside their services that were regulated by the CQC. And there's an interdependency between those services. So if you offer what was called housing support, for example, and you're
Yes.
then if that's commissioned,
Sorry to interrupt, but just focusing on
Yeah.
the regulated sector, because that's.
But I think so. I suppose I'm just trying to answer your question, which was about was there anything specific for not-for-profit, and the
Yes.
specific bit was because it was
Because it's
operating
part and
both.
part, yes.
If you constrict one or you cut the funding off for one set of services, it has an impact on the regulated services.
I see. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Can I move on then to your role during the pandemic? And as I've said, one of the key things that you did was to advocate on behalf of the sector. Is it right that the two other things that you did were, A, navigating guidance on behalf of your members,
Yeah.
supporting them to help them understand what the guidance was and know when changes came in?
Yeah.
And the second thing that you did was engage with the UK government on their behalf. Just briefly dealing with the navigating of guidance first, if I may. Is it right that the National Care Forum issued around 200 briefings during the course of the pandemic? And during the majority of the first wave, those were daily.
Yes.
Just help us, please. Were those briefings delivered by email?
Yes, they would be.
And it's right, isn't it, that at some point during the pandemic you opened up that service much more widely to the sector?
Yes.
Did that include for-profit organisations?
Yes.
So it was to the sector
Yeah.
as a whole.
Yes.
And just help us to understand. So how would those organisations have known and have been party to that service? Would they have registered with you and then gone onto the email list, or how would they know about it?
Yes, or it would be cascaded through other organisations they might be part of. So, I mean, we're very enthusiastic about working together. So we're part of something called the Care Provider Alliance that brings together all of the trade bodies that work in the care sector, and we work with lots of local care associations as well. So we shared all that information with whoever wanted it, really. And alongside those emails, we had weekly briefing meetings, which again we included many other people in. We produced lots of resources and made as much as we could freely available to everybody.
Thank you. So the Care Providers Alliance, it's right that is an umbrella
Yes.
organisation, and in fact one that you currently chair?
Yes.
So how many organisations are there?
So there's 10
There's
trade
10.
bodies in that.
And is it right that each takes it in turn to chair it?
They do.
For a year at a time?
Yes.
So you weren't the chair
I wasn't.
during the pandemic. And as far as the CPA is concerned, is it right that their reach covers about 95%
Yes.
of the adult social care sector?
Yes.
And so in terms of an organisation that the government, when it comes to future pandemics, may use as a source of distributing information, would you say that they are an appropriate body to work with in that sense?
Yes. Absolutely.
In terms of advocacy, you issued over 150 press releases, is that right, during the pandemic, on a wide range of topics, so covering, for example, death data, visiting restrictions and things like that, is that right? And that was often jointly with other representative groups, as you've told us you liked working together. Did you also undertake a range of surveys?
Yes.
Do you know how many of those you undertook?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but I would think it would be around about 30 surveys on different topics, sometimes repeat surveys on the same topic. And we also engaged in lots of research where that was available as well. We stimulated research happening as well, and brought members together with academics and other experts to ensure that the best information was available.
Sorry, I don't know if I misheard. Did you say stimulated research?
Yes, so for example, the less COVID research, we worked directly with Leeds University, supported by the Dunhill Medical Trust, to get early understanding of the impact of COVID on older people.
And just could you just explain what stimulated research is? What does that mean?
We talked to researchers and said this is vital that somebody's looking at this. It wasn't being looked at by the government. There was a massive gap in terms of understanding of how COVID impacted older people, what was happening in care homes. And so we have good, strong relationships with universities. And so we were able to work with them at pace to produce some research.
And just briefly, what were the key findings of Less COVID?
So Less COVID was really focused on what the experiences of was within care homes, so that the key kind of learnings were that the way in which COVID manifested for older people was not the way the government was describing symptoms. We were telling the government this, and of course that created a problem when it wasn't possible to access tests unless people were symptomatic in line with the government's version of symptoms. But this Less COVID was showing, and our work with members showed it was very different. It showed that there had been siloed approaches to healthcare, and so people were not able to access healthcare within care settings, and that included the care that was needed for end-of-life care. It sort of laid bare, I think, some of the kind of isolation that care homes had experienced particularly during that first wave.
So very important research.
Very important research.
The inquiry heard earlier in the week that there were some big gaps in the data available,
Yeah.
And the infrastructure was quite lacking when it came to data. With regard to the research and the surveys that you were carrying out, were they covering the sector as a whole, or were they specific to the not-for-profit sector?
So generally our surveys would have been with our members directly. Obviously, probably the one that we thought was most important to start with was one about the deaths within care homes. We were hearing directly from members of the very huge toll within care homes, and we weren't seeing any of that reflected in government data. So yes, that survey particularly was carried out directly with members, asking them with a week apart what their experience was and what was happening within their homes. And that we published that, I think, on the 19th of April, 10 days before the government produced any data on the deaths within care homes.
And we'll go to that in a moment. But with the surveys, were they collecting quantitative data or qualitative data based on people's experiences, or was it a mix of the two?
It was a mix. If you could ask a question with a number, we did, because we know people love numbers. But we also wanted to capture some of the real life experience of people as well. So it was a mix. And later on, we developed what were called pulse surveys. So we developed those on a monthly basis, which looked at core areas once it became clear what they were. So things like access to PPE, access to testing, visiting, all of the sort of things that were part of the ongoing delivery. of care within a pandemic, and we wanted to use those to kind of provide a benchmark to say how things were changing or how resources were or weren't reaching the front line.
We heard that the Vivaldi surveys were carried out by telephone with the managers of care homes. How are yours carried out? And
Usually by email.
By email. So was it a
online
questionnaire
questionnaires
that
yes.
was distributed? And
Yes.
generally, what kind of response rates did you have?
Again, without looking at individual surveys, but we had, we always reflected it as a percentage of the membership, and I think we were generally getting 60-70% of the membership. Excuse me.
And was the data that you were gathering through these surveys purely to assist you and to help you with your advocacy, or was the data sent directly to the government?
It was always sent directly to the government, as well as the advocacy, as part of our advocacy, but also it was, I think, I hope it's reflected in the papers that you've seen. We felt it was very important to keep the government as up to date as possible in terms of both the questions and challenges that were happening, but also to, show them, what the direct experience was of people on the front line.
And was the data that was gathered through the surveys collated in a structured and formalised way?
It was we used a tool, probably something like SurveyMonkey, and it was utilised. We pulled it together in that way. So there would be a variety of, depending on the topic. Sometimes it would be anonymised. Generally, we asked a similar set of questions so we could stratify it. What's the size of your organisation? Because we were aware that different size organisations were impacted differently by different elements. What group of people are you working with? What types of settings are you talking about? So, yes, we definitely tried to represent it in that way. And if it wasn't anonymous, because we wanted to follow up with people, then we would ask them if they would be happy to be followed up with directly. And for sometimes we would ask people if they were happy to be connected directly to government, and sometimes we brought people directly to government as part of a round table or because they had a particular issue or problem. So particularly when we found an early issue that hadn't been raised before, for example, when it became clear that quite early on in the pandemic, when people were coming up for insurance renewal, for example, and were being told by insurance companies they would no longer provide any public liability insurance, which is a fundamental problem because it's part of a regulatory requirement, we brought those members directly to government officials to say, you need to take this issue seriously.
And how receptive did you find government? And when we say government, are we talking about the DHSC?
Talking about the DHSC primarily. Sometimes we would have gone to other departments, but we sort of saw them as a route through if there was a need to bring in other people.
Did you ever work with any of the scientific advisory groups, the modelling groups, for example, to assist in the response?
I didn't personally, but my colleague Liz Jones was involved in the social care working group.
But in terms of the provision of data, I think she was a member of the group.
Yes.
But in terms of the provision of data, did the government or any of those groups come to the National Care Forum and say, look, we've got these gaps. Are you able to survey your members and collect this individual care home level data for us?
No, not to my recall.
Is that something that you were set up to do, to be able to do during the pandemic?
Well, we weren't set up to do that in that sense, but if there had been an opportunity to do that, I'm pretty sure we'd have grabbed onto it if it was possible to do without significant burden. And I think that is part of the balance, I guess, that we were always aware that if you were going to ask people to do things, then they needed to, you needed to balance that appropriately with what else they were trying to cope with, and also you needed to give them information back. And so there was a corporate data collection vehicle, which was a capacity tracker. And so whether those particular scientific questions were being fielded through that, we did sit on some of the groups that looked at the data that was being collected. And I think our big, we're very supportive of the need for a better data infrastructure, but what never came forward in a way that appeared helpful was feeding that data back to the sector itself. So not recognising that actually with that information people could have made active choices to perhaps do things differently or...
We heard earlier in the week how, especially when it comes to the domiciliary care sector, there are real difficulties in gathering some of this baseline data. Are there any practical recommendations that you would invite the inquiry to make to deal with some of those difficult issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a huge amount of data in the care sector which can tell us lots of things about the kind of well-being of individuals, what supports them to to deliver effective care, and so forth. So I think in terms of the recommendations, we need to invest in that data infrastructure. We don't have routinely in care organisations people who hold a role of data analysis, for example. At the beginning of the pandemic, we only had 20% of care providers who had electronic care records. And yet one of the early learnings from the less COVID research was that actually having an electronic care record made it so much more straightforward to understand what was happening to people.
And has that position improved now?
That position has now improved. So the government did eventually invest in that, but not until April 2022, so after the pandemic. So there was quite a shift in terms of take-up, but that was all care providers investing in that kind of data system for themselves.
Sorry to speak over you. Perhaps focusing more on the domiciliary care sector, and it may be that we need to ask the Home Care Association about this too. But do you have any insights into how we might deal with that tricky issue of gathering data from not just regulated domiciliary care providers, but also unpaid carers?
I don't have in relation to unpaid carers, but for domiciliary care, it's the same. There is the same opportunity in terms of electronic care records, and there is a good take-up of electronic care records now within domiciliary care. I think that there are great opportunities going forward about supporting people to own their own data. So that would be an opportunity for unpaid carers to be able to contribute data that they observe and that they identify in the delivery of their care. And you can see that in some of the initiatives that have happened with things like virtual wards, for example, where people who are looking after somebody in their own home are asked to carry out blood pressure monitoring and things and gather that kind of data. So I think there are ways like that. But I think probably the other side of it is social care data has not been recognised as important because the professional skills and expertise of that sector are not recognised in that way. So we haven't seen it as valuable in the past. And I think, I hope that's one of the sort of the opportunities from the pandemic to recognise that actually that data could tell us, if you wanted to understand how COVID impacted on somebody with dementia, the only people who could really tell you that were people who were working in social care, because they were the people who were looking after and supporting those individuals. And we were not routinely asking those people or enabling them to carry out that data collection in a meaningful way.
Thank you. And do you have any, before we leave this topic, do you have any insights in relation to research in the adult social care sector?
Yes. I mean, there's lots of work we do, ongoing work with academics in the context of research. I mean, I think one of the successes of something like Less COVID and other research that we've been involved in subsequently is having the operational expertise involved at the development of that research. So not creating studies which won't have a material day-to-day impact. And I think the other element is about speed. So the changes in terms of what we want to do with research, generally the priorities are things that need to change quickly. So we need to think about how we can utilise some of the speeding up of research, speeding up of approvals, for example, and things like that that happened during COVID, and think about how they can be applied in real time now.
So could a solution be, for example, to have a number of sleeping contracts for specific types of research that could be activated quickly?
Well, and to create and to think about those sort of bits of the architecture we don't have in social care, like a social care data observatory, that would mean you could regularly feed this in. We have huge amounts of wonderful research of the voices of people in care, which provide great insight and great recognition of the importance of of what people value, and yet because we don't capture that in a sort of central repository, we can't learn from them again and again. And I think we need to think about how we do that.
And who do you say should be responsible for maintaining that sort of repository?
I mean, I think from my perspective, social care is a public service. If we want to improve the public service, then the people who have overall responsibility for the public service, which is the government in the context of the Care Act, should make sure we've got the best available information, expertise, innovation available for those who are going to receive care. That's our commitment, is to deliver the best care for people, to enable them to live the most fulfilling lives. That data, that richness of experience would tell us what that is. And so, if we're going to deliver better public services, let's invest in that.
Okay, but you wouldn't specify a particular...
Well, I would specify that, the government already funds NIH and the National Institute of Health and Care Research. It's that kind of body that I think we should be looking at. The government's looking to fund very significant data platforms, for example. If we can get the social care data from that and draw that into ongoing plans for the development, we're just started a significant reform exercise through Baroness Casey's commission.
Yes.
That's exactly that sort of data should and could inform a commission.
Thank you. I said earlier that we'd go to the deaths press release, but I hope we've covered it. Is it a fair summary to say that in April 2020 you carried out a survey which showed that the number of deaths in care home was much greater than that had been reported, and you say that by the end of April, as a result of that advocacy, the data did start to be properly reported in public?
Yes.
Is that right?
It is. I think what we also did at that time was make really clear the things that needed to happen to prevent it further and support the sector, and those things didn't happen in the way that we talked about. And I mean, there are various things that came along as time progressed, but key issues like the access to community health care, access to expertise and geriatricians coming into care homes or explicitly looking at the experience of care homes was not happening, nor was the sort of testing of everybody within care homes. And I think whether you're going to focus on the discharge experience, but we were relaying what members were telling us. We're not sitting in a body. I'm not sitting in a position claiming clinical expertise in that sense. We were telling them what was actually happening and what members said that they needed to have in order to ensure that the people they were looking after were as safe as possible.
And with that particular issue of geriatricians coming into care homes. Did that improve as a result of your advocacy?
It raised the issue. I don't think we saw a direct response in terms of that.
Thank you. The next topic is, in fact, your engagement with the government. I'm just going to go back in time a bit to January. So if we could please look at our first document. It's at tab 3 of your bundle if you want to turn it up, Professor. It's INQ 000 532 335. And if we start, please, with page, I think 6, sorry, of that document. Can you see that there's an email from you on the 24th of January 2020 to various people at the DHSE? And is it right that you were in contact with the DHSE at this early stage to raise concerns about the potential impact of the pandemic on members? And do you remember what it was specifically that triggered you to take that action?
Members getting in touch with us directly to say, what should we be doing? How should we be protecting staff and people we're working with?
But at that early stage, what was it in particular that was
I think
concerning
people had seen the stories of what was happening in Wuhan and were thinking about how that might have an impact here.
So they were thinking ahead to what preparations they could put in place at that time so that they would be better prepared for something if it did come along. And in this email, were you asking the DHSE whether the guidance that you had found online, which I think was available for healthcare services, was the one that you should be advising your members to apply, or whether there was any other guidance or advice that you should be...
I think I was thinking, if people are asking me, I'm kind of hoping that people are asking internally in government, and somebody's busy thinking about how social care should prepare.
Yes. And if we look at page 5, we can see that you received a response that day and, in fact, replied back saying, I understand. So if we go to the top of the page... So this is after you've had an initial response saying that they would look into it and get back to you. And then you say, yes, I understand we've been connecting across a number of levels. What was that in reference to?
That was because they were saying 2 other colleagues had been in touch with the same questions.
With the same questions. And you say, in fact, I suspect that is reflective of the growing concern amongst providers who've been contacting us individually, wondering if there is any particular action they should be taking. And you go on to say that you'll be able to ensure that the information received gets shared across the CPA and on the website. What was the purpose of you including that in your email?
Why did I say that?
Yes.
Just to be clear that they didn't, because the other colleagues who had connected were from the CPA. So I wanted to be clear that I was going to take that action and that they didn't have to. So it was a sort of message to government and to my colleagues to say,
and was it
we'll do it once.
You can use us as a vehicle to communicate with a
yeah, I mean,
yes,
partly that too, yeah.
And is it right that you were then told by the government that the guidance that you had sent a link to was indeed the one that you should be directing your members to, and that was the healthcare specific guidance? And then if we go to page 3, please, we can see that on the 13th of February, it's the page before, please, page 3. You got in contact again on the 13th of February.
Yeah.
And you say there that the reason that you're coming back is to provide some feedback on specific concerns that members have been raising with you when trying to apply that guidance. Is that right? And you then set out a number of key concerns of your members, which included problems with being able to self-isolate, problems with accessing PPE or knowing what PPE they should be accessing. You also highlight workforce issues. And then you say in the penultimate paragraph that it's imperative that you provide some targeted guidance for the sector that picks up on these and other issues. And you explain that it's a very fractured sector and you want to ensure that all those who receive care and support continue to be provided with safe and effective care.
Yeah.
So was this early warning of the issues that in fact ended up being accurate as to the key issues that eventuated in the pandemic?
Yeah. I mean, it's probably one of many emails that we sent through, basically just saying the guidance that was being produced was not adequate. It didn't demonstrate any operational understanding of how social care was delivered on the ground. We may go on to look at it, but
yes,
when further guidance was developed, which supposedly was accurate or targeted at social care, it continued, I think, to not address the issues that have been raised.
Yes, and we will go
Yeah.
on to that. So just keeping to the chronology, if we can. So you've got in contact end of January, mid-February. You're saying we really need bespoke guidance, and just for completeness with this chain, we can see that on page 2 you're told that there's a small team coordinating central support at DHSC and that they'd get back to you. And then on page 1, is it right that you were saying that you, paraphrasing, it's a very rapidly developing thing that's happening, but you would appreciate, rather than waiting for central guidance, which might take some time, you would prefer to have small bits of advice quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that clearly this is written before we knew what some of the challenges of waiting for guidance would look like.
Yes.
Yes, I think that I'm trying to give them some opportunities to get something out that's clear what people should be doing. So if you've got a sector of 18,500 organisations, in my mind, getting 18,500 organisations to work it out for themselves doesn't seem a sensible or efficient way of responding to a crisis. So it was to try and say, if you can't get it perfect, get something that will help people to know what to do right now. And plan. I mean, I think it's all about this. At this stage, it's very much planning. So, if it was going to be, as it then transpired, something that needed larger amounts of PPE or some of the things that it's now clear that the government was talking about behind the scenes, in a sense, if providers had known some of that, then it would have been possible to be better prepared. It might have been, in terms of doing things like thinking about what isolation might look like and how can you build that into your structure in a care home. But that's what we were looking for, some sense of that.
So you were looking for as much advance notice as possible
I mean, that's my job,
the types of things that you might need to put in place. Yeah. And we can see in that email that you say in the third line from the bottom, happy to help. Was that you, again, offering to help?
Yes.
And what did you mean by that? Was that a reference to helping with co-production of guidance? Yeah,
I mean, generally it would be about, either looking at something and giving some feedback or testing it on people or asking people who'd got experience. It's not, it's not that there wouldn't be anybody who didn't have some of the answers perhaps out in the sector that we could have drawn on.
Thank you. And just at the top of that page, we can see that DHSC, in fact, agree with you that getting out what they can to the sector quickly is more useful than hanging around for a blockbuster edition. Yeah. And then if we go to tab 18 in your bundle, which is INQ 4051203, please. And if we start at page 6, and again working backwards, we can see that on the 19th of February 2020, that a draft, is it right, this is the draft of the guidance that eventually came out on the 25th of February?
Yes.
So a draft is sent to you and others. attaching, in an email, and we can see that you received that at 1:54 hours on the 19th of February. And in the email itself, they're saying that the deadline for reply is lunchtime tomorrow.
Yes.
So it would be helpful to have returns by 12 at the latest. So you had less than a day
Yes.
to respond. And was that sufficient for you to be able to meaningfully input and respond to that draft guidance, do you think?
No. I mean, clearly, patently not if I'm going to do something directly with providers. I mean, as we had already started to raise issues and discussions, I mean, we did respond and gave lots of detailed feedback around it. But I think it's yeah. I mean, I think if this is about getting people prepared and in the right space, then we felt that something that absolutely talked to people in the settings and environments that they were working in was going to be crucial. If you get a bunch of stuff that doesn't relate to your experience, then all you've got to do is reinterpret that and try and understand it and fit it into the space that you're in. So, yeah, I mean, more time would have been helpful. Clarity, think at this stage, setting up, working groups that could do this. This was sent to me. I've no doubt it was sent to a variety of other people as well to comment as well.
Yes.
No inducement for us to work together or to. So where we're trying to do some of that as much as we can, and I've done that.
Yes.
Through a tried and tested mechanism of copying in multiple people to show them what our thoughts were so they could respond rather than getting them to do it themselves.
The reason I asked is because I think you and also a number of other people in their evidence talk about the lack of time that they had.
Yes.
To respond to draft guidance, for example.
Yeah.
But is it a fair summary of what you said, that you've got to balance things and you appreciated that on the one hand there was a need to get things out quickly to the sector. So although ideally you would have had more time, actually you appreciate that this was a fast-moving situation, and so...
Yeah, I think it's a fast-moving situation. It's a situation where lots of people are just beginning to think about it as well.
Yes.
But I suppose the point would be that at this stage you could have set up something more meaningful to focus on guidance on an ongoing basis that would mean you didn't get yourself in this mess time and time
Yes.
again, because this was a repeated pattern of less than 24 hours to respond to anything, a repeated pattern of asking multiple people without being clear who's been asked. So then, as a government, getting multiple responses, which they were trying to balance. There wasn't a weighting, I understood, that was attached to operational reality versus clinical guidance, for example.
Yes. So is it the case that you're saying that groups that are co-producing guidance and policy should be set up right at the start
Yes.
of an emergency,
Yes.
whereas what in fact happened was that you were being sent almost finalised versions of guidance and not given an opportunity to shape that guidance.
Yeah. Well, I think often
as it's written.
at this early stage we were getting guidance that had and social care added in behind health. I mean, that's as bespoke as it felt.
Thank you. And if we look at page 4 of this chain, we can see that, just summarising, you say that the information is helpful, and in the second paragraph, you say, however, I think that the advice, whilst talking about the care sector, does not feel like bespoke guidance, that will reflect the reality of someone in either a home care or residential setting. And you go on to say that there are some really practical challenges that you think the guidance either needs to recognise or better still address.
Yes.
And then you go on, don't you, to set those out.
Yeah.
And again, just summarising, you talk about older people who are living with dementia or very profound learning disabilities, and the practical difficulties they would have, for example, with face masks or self-isolation.
Yeah.
you talk about the storage of waste and how guidance that would be given to hospitals where there would be special areas to store waste would not apply to someone, for example, with incontinence pads building up in their own home. They've got no other space. You talk about laundry in the same context. And you go on to explain, quite importantly, that personal care, in fact, involves care workers being in very close contact.
Closer than 2 metres, yes.
And therefore the advice that was being given that people should avoid being within 2 metres didn't really apply. And then you go on to talk about self-isolation again. And then you say that you would recommend that before the guidance is published that you're given an opportunity to have a second review of that guidance. Did that happen?
I don't know, to be honest with you. It came out a few days later, so quite possibly not.
Thank you. And then on page 5, we can see in the last main paragraph that you say that there's a wide range of other issues that you know have been discussed, and that relates to issues that you'd already raised in January and February in relation to things like workforce, PPE supplies, and additional costs. Is that right?
Yes.
Of the equipment that was being required.
Equipment, working in different ways, trying to support people who are being isolated. You know.
Thank you. And just for completeness again, if we look at page 2, we can see that other people who were copied in, so at the bottom of the page, that's the Care Quality Commission responding to your email saying that they had nothing to add beyond what you had raised. They agreed that it wasn't particularly tailored to the adult social care context, and they encouraged the taking up of the offer of working with the Care Provider Alliance to make sure that the guidance landed well and didn't create a high volume of follow-up questions and feedback that they had no plan for addressing. So the position is that they're saying, actually, this is going to save you work if you put the work in now. And on page 1, we can see, in between there's also a response from the Director of Association for Real Change. And then on page 1, there's also a response from the government saying that you made some good points, but also raising the fact that social care is also provided a great deal by unpaid carers and personal assistants. And it would be helpful to have that reflected in the guidance. So that's someone within the government raising that in February. And did the guidance in February that was issued on the 25th include all of those points?
I don't think it did, but I haven't got that, the detail of that.
If we look at, please, INQ 4049574.
Do you know what tab that is?
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't make a note of this one. I'm just trying to look it up now. I think it's tab 17. And I'm not going to go into the details of this, but just to have a quick look. We can see that this is a meeting on the 10th of March. It's a meeting between Liz Jones, who's your policy director, and 53 members.
Yeah.
And we can see that the purpose of that, if we look at the session aims, is to support members, but also in the 4th paragraph, we can see that what's noted there, that it's important to try to engage, to try to ensure government does not make incorrect assumptions about how local areas are responding, and the ability of providers to respond on their own without coordination and support across local authorities, local health systems and supply chains. And was the plan to feed back these concerns to the government, I think at this stage through the National Steering Group?
Yes. So there were various iterations of early groups, and the National Steering Group may have been one iteration of that. But
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And sorry to rush you, but I just want to deal with this quite quickly,
yes, of course,
because we will be moving on to the various groups that were set up. But on the 10th of March, is it right that you were raising similar concerns again, But in addition, at this point, you're also raising the concern that actually it wasn't something that could be coordinated locally, and that there were concerns about the response that had been received so far locally from local resilience forums, the NHS, and community healthcare.
Yes.
And so was this on the 10th of March, the National Care Forum really saying to the government, we need central leadership and coordination?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were part of the challenge throughout the pandemic, to be honest, was about the relationship between national, regional and local systems, and indeed between different parts of national government. So, for example, in areas like guidance, we had number of different bodies making guidance. So Public Health making guidance, NHS England making guidance, DHSC making guidance, which all interrelated. And then what happened is that went out to local systems, and sometimes it said things like, you know, the local director of public health will make a decision in relation to this. So then there was another layer of decision making and direction that providers had to experience. I think that early on it was obvious that there did need to be some national steerage of it, but the sort of those inconsistencies between who held decision-making powers that were evident from the 10th of March and earlier, to be honest, onwards, continued throughout the pandemic, actually.
Thank you. And I don't think we need to go to them, but is it right that one of the issues that you had to repeatedly raise similar concerns about was in relation to PPE?
Yes.
And you have exhibited, for example, communications, I think, from Liz Jones on the 1st of April 2020, and again on the 7th of April 2020, raising concerns about guidance, and in particular the sector-specific PPE guidance that was issued.
Yes.
In April.
So that guidance was issued with. That was the first, on the 2nd of April, that was the first kind of bespoke PPE guidance, but it wasn't, it didn't feel bespoke. It referred, it tried to compare domiciliary care, sessions with ward rounds. It talked about, it very clearly was based around a model where people who were receiving care, which really meant health care in that context, stayed in bed all the time and didn't move anywhere. It was just inappropriate. And it talked about bits of PPE which really were not part of the common usage in the care sector. So particularly around visors and goggles, which are not a day-to-day part of the delivery of social care.
So that stemmed from, you say, a misunderstanding.
I think, yeah, I mean, it just
over-clinicalisation of.
Well, I think if that was what people needed to wear and use, that's, you know, don't think anybody was disputing the kind of clinical expertise. It was more about if this is a piece of guidance that's supposed to give clarity to people who are delivering social care, so that they're confident that they're supporting their staff appropriately and supporting people who deliver care and support, then it had to talk to the experience that they were living. So it was so confusing. We had so many questions about it, and that was on the 2nd of April. Then on the 12th of April,
yes,
they moved to a position of sustained transmission, which required people to shift gear again to another level of PPE, and that was so poorly communicated to the sector.
Is the example that you give in your statement where there's a small
phrase that says we're now in sustained transmission. Look at table 4.
Yes.
You know, and so that meant again that people, you know, were trying desperately. I think that was one of the, you know, very difficult times over an Easter weekend or something. You know, it was one of those periods where people were trying to get hold of PPE. We spent all of our time trying to support members to connect up with local resource resilience forums, access PPE in other ways, trying to and raising those directly with the government centrally, but also working with colleagues in local government and the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services to sort of see if there are ways we could ensure people understood what they needed to do, but also got the resources they needed.
And just to summarise, Professor, on the 1st of April, this is one of the emails, we don't need to go to it, but it's one of the emails that was sent to DHSC about PPE. And in that email, there's a reference to what's called the cycle of doom.
Yes.
Is that right? And,
Yeah.
and that's a reference to care providers feeding back that they were contacting the PPE helpline. The helpline then said, no, either you've had a delivery or you need to talk to your usual suppliers. The usual suppliers would then say, oh no, the NHS have requisitioned all the supplies, you need to speak to them. And then the NHS supply chain would say, no, you need to go to the PPE helpline.
Yes.
And so that's what was,
It was the
called
PPE
the
cycle of doom. Yes. And it was...
in addition to raising issues about wrong PPE being delivered, poor quality PPE being delivered, the rising costs of PPE, and also inconsistent advice about PPE being given by different people.
Yeah, and hugely escalating costs of PPE. I think that's really important to understand. Things that people, were routinely buying, in small quantities, they were now having to buy in huge quantities, and the price had gone up, 100% or more, and there was not funding or support for that.
Thank you. And is it right that the PPE guidance also made the incorrect assumption that care providers, in fact, had a stock of PPE, but you say in your statement that actually the use of PPE within the sector was pretty limited before the pandemic?
So people would have had PPE for instances where they needed to do sort of barrier nursing, or, if there was an outbreak of something like norovirus or that, but it's not routinely used for many of the issues we've raised. So if you have a face mask on, for example, that's very difficult to communicate with somebody with a hearing loss or with dementia who's reliant on sort of facial recognition signals, etc. And it's not part of the kind of clinical guidance in those settings.
And sorry to forgive my interrupting. Did you hear Mr. Hancock suggesting that
Yes.
care homes should have a month's supply of PPE? Have you got a comment on that?
Well, his sort of assumption that having that in preparation for a pandemic and the volume of PPE that people were using did not seem to be particularly practical. And there are many other practical recommendations, like, for example, allowing care providers to purchase through the NHS PPE procurement channels, or indeed providing free PPE right from the start at the beginning of a pandemic so that people don't have to rely on that. Of course, providers, they will have some stock available because they need to be prepared for outbreaks of, or a requirement to do that. But yeah, the idea that they have got a month's worth of supply, if they want, this is a broader discussion about what we want providers to do. And actually, if on the 24th of January, there had been an engagement with the sector to say, OK, this is what we think is going to happen. Let's help you get the PPE you need. Let's help you think about what isolation might look like. Let's help you think about the fact you might not be able to move staff. That would be a very different situation.
Thank you.
You talked about the National Steering Group earlier, and is it right that did start meeting fairly early on in the pandemic? But what you say about that in your statement is that the early meetings were ad hoc and uncoordinated. And it wasn't, I think, until the summer of 2020 that the processes became more structured.
Yes. So there were lots of little groups that met about particular topics, and then that all got sort of brought together. But the very early groups were really, meeting with sort of a peer with very short notice, and as far as I'm aware, I don't think we've got particular minutes from those meetings or anything. They were more of a kind of, what's the latest situation?
Did you find them helpful forums for being able to input and pass on the concerns?
I certainly passed on the concerns. I think it's less obvious what happened as an immediate result of that.
And what access did you have through those early forums to decision makers?
I mean, I think we had one of the reflections, I think, in the email you've just shown is that it was a small team in DHSC. So there was a relatively small team focused on social care pre-pandemic. So we had, we did have connection with the director at the time, and to be the Director General and others. So yes, there wasn't a barrier that was put in the way of that. And similarly with the Minister, when Helen Whately came into the ministerial role, that the department encouraged connection with her.
And it's right, isn't it, that you say that those small groups were constantly merging and changing?
Yeah.
Did you think that was a necessary response to the rapidly evolving situation, or did it lead to any overlap, any duplication of work, or groups working in silos?
I think there was definitely some silo working. So often we as an organisation, we're not a big organisation in any stretch of the imagination, and certainly we've tried to go to as many of those meetings as possible, and we often found that we were in those meetings pointing out what the other meetings were talking about. So, trying to connect the workforce meeting, for example, with the discussion around PPE, with the discussion around testing. So there was definitely a need for more coordination in that sense.
And did the same principle apply with guidance writing, that there were various different teams doing the guidance? I think you alluded to that earlier. But
Yes.
did that lead to a lack of coordination?
Yeah, and I think the team that we might have had more opportunity to influence was DHSC when they were writing guidance. We had very little ability to influence PHE or NHS England, where they were writing guidance that was relevant to the social care sector, which lots of it was, but we relied on DHSC colleagues to do that, and I don't know how straightforward that was for them to influence it.
I think in your statement you say that your engagement with PHE improved over time, but they were involved in drafting some of the guidance in February, so quite early on. You say in your statement that DHSC had limited understanding of how adult social care was provided in practice and on the ground. Is that something that you also say applies to PHE or not? Yes.
I would say that. So we had some good engagement with individuals in PHE, and hugely grateful to them for the time that they gave to that. But I think it's only relatively recently in the reformation of UKHSA that there's a specific social care team now within that body. So, that will have a better understanding of the environment in which PHE public health advice has to operate within.
Thank you. And you said earlier that all of these small groups eventually came together, and you were part of the task force, weren't you, led by Mr. Pearson?
Yes.
As far as thinking about the future is concerned, would you say that the membership and the structure of that body is the type of thing that should be replicated again in future? Or do you have any concerns, for example, about any voices that were missing from that group or anything else?
So the task force then split into a number of different subgroups. So yes. I co-chaired the workforce task force side of it, and we came up with a range of short and immediate and short-term actions. I think the problem with that is that they were not implemented. Largely, they were not implemented. They were very they were based on the experience of trade unions, of other workforce representatives, of employers, including people who employ their own assistants. You know, they represented a broad cohort of stakeholder voices. I think the difficulty is that the recommendations didn't manifest. So there is a real challenge about setting up that kind of body,
Yes.
and then not delivering on what it's suggesting. I think
there's no point having a body recommending things if they're not going to be implemented.
No, and I mean, and some of those things, I think, for example, in that context, were about sort of the occupational health and well-being of staff, a
Yes.
crucial concern for employers, a crucial concern for people across the sector, and recommendations about occupational well-being schemes and things that, you know, that could relatively easily have been operationalised and weren't.
Yes, and we have, in fact, your reports from that subgroup,
Yes.
And the inquiries read those. But as far as the structure of those groups are concerned, would you say that they did allow you to meaningfully engage at that time?
Well, it depends whether engagement leads to something, but they certainly allowed us to express a set of perspectives.
You talked about there now being an adult social care team. Just before we end this topic, are there any other specific recommendations that you would invite to help with improving the understanding of decision makers and people who are drafting guidance when it comes to the realities of adult social care operation on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they shouldn't, you know, those kind of decision-making groups shouldn't exist without the experience of the operational experience of both people delivering care and support and people receiving care and support. I mean, I think you can see that in all sorts of decisions that were made, that they would have been much better able to be implemented if they had had that operational experience right from the start. And I think that is there's an underpinning message there about recognising the professionalism and expertise within the sector, that when there are, I mean, I was listening carefully to Mr. Hancock's evidence yesterday when he was talking about social care representation being him and his minister. You know, we are still in a position where the sort of leadership and expertise of social care is not properly recognised and built in, and I think that having that as a legacy of the pandemic would be really valuable to have that built in.
You say the voice should come from the sector?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. My lady, would that be a convenient time?
I hope you were warned that we were going to go over lunch. I'm sorry, I usually try to finish a witness, but I've got to be considerate of the stenographer who had quite a tough day yesterday.
Yes.
So I shall return at 1:45.